Shadow Tower Abyss was a game for the PlayStation 2 developed by FromSoftware back in 2003. You may know FromSoftware from games like Dark Souls, Bloodborne, Sekiro, and Elden Ring. And for any fans of FromSoft's early titles, you may have heard of the Kingsfield series, but maybe not Shadow Tower Abyss. That's because Shadow Tower Abyss was only ever released in Japan. Agetec had apparently almost finished the English localization of the game before Sony decided to cancel the project. Sony tends to do this kind of crap a lot. So the version of the game I'll be taking a look at is a fan translation. And I'm also emulating it, so you may see graphical glitches here and there throughout the video. More importantly though, the fact this game was only ever released in Japan means there are no guides for it, and almost no one has any idea what the lore of the game is or how certain mechanics even work. Luckily, I found online copies of the game manual and the official strategy guide, both in Japanese only. So now I can finally provide you much needed context that has been missing in any of the reviews of the game up to this point. I also wrote up my findings for some of the mechanics on the GameFAQs page. So anyone who ever wants to know how some of this stuff works in the future can finally have free access. The stuff I managed to translate from the manual and guide is honestly one of the things I'm most excited to share with you, so stay tuned for that. There's also some historical context around the early FromSoftware titles that if you're not familiar with may help explain some of the very strange design choices made by this game, especially in regard to the mechanics of movement and some of the RPG elements. Kingsfield was the first RPG game that FromSoftware developed back in 1994 for the PS1. This spun off a series of games that were all first-person dungeon crawler RPGs that were very experimental for the time. A lot of the design choices and principles from this experimental period carry through all their games, even up to Elden Ring, which was released in 2022. This includes dark, interconnected worlds, a deep and minimalistic story and lore, hidden secrets, recurring items and enemies, and immersive hostile environments. FromSoftware in general designs all their games with respect to what came before, and Shadow Tower Abyss is no exception. The original Shadow Tower was a game released in 1998 for the PS1 and is the prequel to Shadow Tower Abyss. It was a game very similar to the Kingsfield games of the same time, but could be considered the Bloodborne of this period. It was similar enough to the main franchise, but different enough in both mechanics and theme to establish itself as a standalone game. The same applies to Shadow Tower Abyss. A lot of the design choices of Kingsfield still remain, but it presents enough unique differences that make it stand apart from the rest. One example is that, unlike Kingsfield, Shadow Tower Abyss actually has guns in it, which dramatically changes the game's setting, tone, and gameplay. More on that later. Full disclosure, I haven't played any of the Kingsfield games or the original Shadow Tower, but I definitely intend to eventually, especially after playing Shadow Tower Abyss. As I mentioned, a lot of the choices from Kingsfield carry over to Shadow Tower Abyss, so I'll point these out as we go along. So let's start the game and watch the intro cutscene.
かつてその森の奥には一つの国があった。不可思議な力と儀式をもって民を治めた王は傍らに異形の槍を携えていたという。王は槍の力によって諸国を平らげ王国に未曾有の繁栄をもたらしたがその陰でひそやかに行われた儀式のことを知る者はなかった。遥かな時の果て槍の王の名が伝承の中にすらおぼろげとなった今一人の老人に導かれたある男がその地を訪れた。
You start out in these ruins lit by a torch with a large carving on the wall nearby. Just as you start to take in your surroundings, the torch goes out, immediately setting the tone of the game right away. After a second or two, your vision adjusts to the darkness, and you get a good idea of the way this game wants to present the world to you. Dark and unsettling. Now that we can start playing, let's talk about the controls. The unconventional movement scheme is one of the main things Shadow Tower Abyss borrows from the early FromSoft RPGs like Kingsfield. In a typical first-person game, you would use the left analog stick to move and the right analog stick to look around, but FromSoftware does things differently. You use the D-pad or left analog stick to move you forwards and backwards, but turn you left and right. L1 and R1 make you strafe left and right, L2 looks up, and R2 looks down. And for Shadow Tower Abyss, each direction on the right analog stick refers to the direction you want to swing your weapon. It kinda makes sense, but it's just weird. For anyone who's never seen this control scheme before, I'm sorry to be the one to introduce it to you. It's pretty bizarre and can be difficult to use, but luckily Shadow Tower Abyss is one of the few FromSoft games of this era that has the option to switch controls, so I chose to do that for this playthrough. So with the Type 4 control scheme you get, the D-pad and left analog stick move forwards, backwards, left, and right, and the right analog stick works as expected now, moving the camera in whatever direction you push it. There is a problem with this though. The game was still designed with the expectation that you're using R2 or L2 as inputs to look up and down, so when using the right analog stick, it tends to swing around very imprecisely. So throughout this video, you might notice me swinging the camera all over the place. Otherwise, the rest of the controls are pretty straightforward. Circle to interact, X to open the menu, triangle to swap weapons, square to cast spells, L1 is a swing from left to right or holsters your gun, R1 is a swing from right to left or unholsters your gun on the first press, then fires the gun after pressing it again. L2 is a stab forward, R2 is an overhead swing, and neither L2 or R2 do anything if you have a gun equipped. Start is a shortcut button which you can set in the equip menu, which you'll see more on later, and select pauses the game. Shadow Tower Abyss also uses a weapon gauge, which really sets itself apart from the standard hit, wait for your bar to fill up, then hit again cycle that the Kingsfield games follow. Instead, we have these little yellowish orbs on your screen here. These represent how many swings you can take with a melee weapon, or how many bullets you have left in your magazine if you're using a gun. Each time you swing a melee weapon, one orb is used up. Once all the orbs are gone, you have to wait about a second or two for one to come back. When you fire a gun, each bullet is represented by an orb. Once all the orbs are gone, you have to reload the weapon, assuming you have any extra ammo in your inventory. If not, your gun will simply stay empty. That's most of the base mechanics. There's also magic, which functions similar to the weapon gauge, but I'll go into that later on. There's no jump or anything like that, and movement is very, very slow. There are many times throughout the playthrough that I end up using a speed hack to walk from place to place. Ironically, doing so caused me to die more often by accident than I ever died from playing the game normally, so be careful if you decide to do the same thing. With that out of the way, I go ahead and walk up to the carving on the wall that reads, "The king dwells in his dark tower. We endure the ages, but he no longer visits us. You who were offered to the darkness, seek his spear. Only the spear bearer commands us. Only he may leave the abyss." Well, we immediately know what our goal for the game is. Travel through the tower and get the king's spear so we can leave the abyss. Pretty simple. So we set off down the stairs and... This is one of those little FromSoftware quirks that is very much a design point used in all of their games. FromSoft loves to kill their players in sneaky and sometimes bullshit ways, and they especially like to do it early on within your first playthrough of a game, which really functions quite well to inform you that this is not a game or a world that will be comfortable to you. It will be hostile and unforgiving, so prepare yourself. This kind of design is absolutely fundamental to the identity of all FromSoft games, and Shadow Tower Abyss is no exception here. So, we restart the game and continue down the stairs to find a dying man who tells us to go in deeper and kill them all. This guy comes off as a little unhinged, but he gives us a knife to help us out, so I'll take it. Now's a good time to talk about the menus. The item menu is just a list of all the items that aren't your standard weapons or equipment. This includes consumables and key items. The databook menu is a nice feature that gives you some information on the maps, creatures, and items of the game as you come across them. The maps databook menu tells you your percentage completion for each area, but I didn't realize that until I had already beaten the game. The item databook just tells you the same details you see in your equipment menu. And lastly, the creatures databook menu gives names and stats of creatures as well as a brief description. So, continuing on, we have load game, options, and the equipment menu. The equipment menu is a bit of a mess to look at the first time, so let me lay it out for you. We have HP, MP, and total weight at the top left, followed by a bunch of weird looking stats running down the screen. I'll explain these in more detail later. To the right of your stats is your equipment. You have a slot for a ring, helmet, gloves, chest piece, 2 weapons, a bracelet, pants, and an amulet. As you cycle through each of these slots, you'll see the list of items you can equip, as well as a description of the item's image, durability, and weight in the top right of the screen. There's also a shortcut item slot here, which lets you assign an item to the start button to use without needing to open your menu. I personally chose to keep a healing potion in this slot for the entire game, and I highly recommend you do the same. It looks like I already have a handgun in my first slot. Nice. One thing you'll really want to remember is you move and turn much slower when you have a gun unholstered. So if you're using a gun, make sure to holster it until you actually want to shoot. I go ahead and equip my knife in the other slot, and I see what the data book refers to as a gallop, and I head after it with my knife. I take a swing and his arm immediately comes off. Then his other. Then his head. Dismemberment is one of the key features of Shadow Tower Abyss that sets it apart from the other early FromSoft titles. You'll see how this mechanic affects the way you approach different enemies and situations as we go along. So, dismembering that gallop felt pretty satisfying, but let's try out the gun. I see 2 more gallops ahead and I take one out as the other runs off. Just nearby is a body stab with one of the spears the Galps are holding and a bucket hat just beside it, so I go ahead and equip that as well. I take out 2 more Galps, learning that cutting their heads off is an instant kill, which is our first example of how dismemberment can change the dynamic of combat. Now their heads are going to be my primary target. A bit ahead, I come to a window with a man lying down and breathing heavily on the other side. I can't interact with him from here, so I just decide to move on for now. Just as I head forward, I hear a bunch of sounds coming from a nearby cave and see 3 normal Galps and 1 special gray Galp. Throughout the game, there are multiple versions of the same base enemy type in each area, and often there will be a black or gray version that is basically the same as the original, but has higher stats and often guards a valuable piece of loot, so stay on the lookout for these.
Anyway, I started blasting. Bang! Bang!
And immediately the cliff below me breaks and I'm in the thick of it. This is another one of those classic FromSoftware tricks. I take out all the Galps and the gray one drops our first amulet. I also notice some nearby Cunes lying in the water. Cunes are the currency of Shadow Tower Abyss and will be used for buying new items and equipment later. So I try equipping the new amulet and press the triangle button to open the guide menu. This menu is pretty important as some items will have benefits that don't show in the normal equipment menu. This amulet, for example, increases magic, but also has a plus resist magic bonus that you can't normally see. Every time you get new gear, you should make sure to check this menu. I end up finding the guy from the window lying dead against a rock. I take a look around the room and I see a sword and a stone, so I take it and a hole blows open in the floor. This hole is how you continue through the rest of the game, but I'm not done exploring this area yet, so I'll come back here later. Going down a different path, I come across these creepy baby Galps called Galpus that aren't particularly dangerous, but they do come with a description of violent soon after birth. Lovely. I'm sure there won't be any disturbing circumstances related to their birth that we'll come across later, right? Anyway, shortly after I also come across this strange blue glowing thing. This is our save point. There are 4 kinds of these little glowy pillars in the game, and each color does a different thing. Blue is for save points, green is for a shop and item storage, purple is for repairing items, and red is for healing your character. The blue and green stations are pretty straightforward, but the purple and red ones are quite interesting. To repair your items, you sacrifice your HP. The amount you sacrifice depends on the item, and if the item is completely broken, it requires much more to repair. When you use the red station to heal, you sacrifice your items to heal your HP and MP to full. This could have created a very interesting dynamic in managing your items. You could sacrifice items you don't need, so you have enough health to repair the items you do need. But unfortunately, I almost never needed to use the red station at all because you get so many damn health potions that it was never really necessary. You could just find or buy more when you needed to repair a bunch of items. I think this is a real missed opportunity by the developers here. Continuing on through the forest area, I come across a much larger version of the Galps from before. Thinking I'm in for a difficult fight, I try to cheese it and immediately shoot it in the head to decapitate it for an instant kill. Well, that was easy. Oh, well, okay. This was a great moment at the start of the game. You're introduced early on to the concept of dismemberment, so you think to yourself, oh, I could just headshot every enemy and win. This will be easy. This little moment teaches you pretty early that not all creatures have the same physiology. So when you enter into combat with a new enemy you don't know, you have to play it cautiously and figure out exactly how they work. This is a nice design choice that carries through most of the game and makes new areas and sets of enemies a fresh experience. So I just keep attacking and eventually take him out. After this, I head through more rooms, fighting more Galps, and then I have this little moment of fun. I walk into a room and see these gloves on the ground. I decide to look down to pick them up and see a trail of blood and I think, oh, I'll deal with that in a minute. As I've gone through the area, I've been cutting grass with my sword to see if there's anything inside, and it also helps to not obscure enemies during fights so you can see better. And while I'm busy goofing around, I hear it. Honestly, it's pretty funny, and I have no one to blame but myself in this case. If you actually look around the room as you're entering it, you'll notice the large Galp in a cave just above, as well as the drop-off to the right. So this time, I actually review my surroundings and take out the enemies here no problem. Just ahead down this path is a room with a light overhead and a suspicious-looking wall. I wonder if... Yep. This game has breakable walls that lead to secret passages. Secret walls like this are the bread and butter of games like Shadow Tower Abyss. Having a sudden realization of, wait, that looks weird, or I wonder if, and going to interact with a wall to reveal a secret you discovered all by yourself is a great feeling. Especially when it's met with entire branching pathways with genuinely good rewards in a lot of cases. You'll see exactly what I mean later. In this case, it takes me to this gross gooey egg room with some dead guys holding a military helmet and some extra mags for my pistol. Nearby, there's a message written in blood on the wall that says, "We are hunted, but they will not let us die." The dead have no rest here. The Spire's awakening eternally calls us from death to life. It turns out, these Gaup creatures are being born from the corpses of all the people like yourself who have been lured to this forest shrine and given as offerings. Their bodies are brought here and used to form these cocoons where the baby Gaups that I mentioned before are born. I'll go more into the lore of this game a bit later. Anyway, feeling like I have no other paths to take, I finally decided to drop down in the hole next to the dead guy from earlier. Heading down this path leads you to this strange frog-like creature with a paddle sitting in a boat. He tells you, "To guide you vile things I am commanded. There is no escape from this world. Do not oppose the powerful. Serve." Okay. We did just read a bit ago about how if we get the spear, we can leave the abyss, and now this boat guy is telling us otherwise? I'm thinking he's probably got some ulterior motive he's not telling us about. Anyway, he paddles us down the river to what is one of my favorite moments of the entire game. I'll speed this up to save some time. I absolutely love this. When you first enter the world of Shadow Tower Abyss, you're in a place that, while not necessarily comforting, is at least recognizable. You start the game in ancient stone ruins that lead down to a weird underground forest with water and grass, but then all that is juxtaposed with the disturbing Gaup creatures, dead bodies, and messages written in blood. You're introduced slowly to the concept of foreign danger and adversity that becomes the staple of this game's entire feel. And once again, you're suddenly thrown to this glowy, mysterious cave leading to an alcove with the game's symbol carved into the wall emitting a bluish-green light. This symbol is the marker for your transitions through the game. It appears on doors that indicate you're traveling from one zone to another, and this massive carving in the wall is your first major transition into the world this game has to offer. One of those marked doors is just within the alcove here, so let's head through it. Whoa. Yeah, this is where I fell in love with this game. Not even an hour into it, and this bizarre alien aesthetic totally captured me. It's really unlike anything I was expecting from this game, and along with the boat ride just before, it really adds to the tone of the entire game. You're in a place that is hostile and alien, and as you move through it, you will be constantly hit with new and unexpected situations. This is a fundamental theme of most FromSoftware RPGs, and they do it better than anyone else. The broad, infinite expanse of darkness contrasted against the giant glowing alien towers, all connected by some strange giant eyeball shooting a beam down into the depths below, all gives you the feeling that you've really stumbled upon something you shouldn't have. And man, I can't wait to see more of it now. On this same point, the transition from the recognizable forest ruin setting to the dark, foreboding, and alien visuals and sound of what will be our hub location is a perfect example of one of the things Shadow Tower Abyss absolutely excels at. Moving from one location to the next is such an exciting experience that fills you with a sense of wonder and curiosity that drives you forward as you play through the game. The first moment you go through one of these marked doors, you're hit with a dramatically distinct visual aesthetic. And each area is very individualistic, so no one area feels too much like the other. But not only is it a visual transformation, you also get a distinct auditory cue every time you enter a new location. Given how there's almost no music at all in this game, these little audio flourishes add impact to these transitions and mark them as genuinely significant. This is core to the theme of Shadow Tower Abyss. It's all about the journey as you move through the tower, facing area after deadly area, each with a new and unique set of enemies, bizarre settings and landscapes, and a variety of distinct scenarios and problems to solve, all just so you can keep moving forward. So, let's do just that. More of the frog-like creatures known as Rofus await inside, and hang around these weird beam-focusing apparatuses surrounded by floating tablets. You can't really interact with any of this stuff, but you can talk to the Rofus who give you a bunch of obtuse lore information. But without a guide, you're gonna have no idea what the hell they're talking about. This is gonna be the section of the video where I give a lengthy explanation of the weird lore of this game. FromSoftware presents lore in its games in a way that is very different to the standard RPG. In most RPGs, you're playing through a story with lots of NPCs, exposition, and clearly defined events that let you know exactly what's going on. FromSoftware does not follow this form of storytelling. Instead, they build out complex and immersive worlds that feel very self-existent outside of the context of being in a video game. When you move through locations in their RPGs, each area feels like it's an actual place with reasons why things are the way they are. FromSoft very heavily follows the methodology of show, don't tell, and they do it better than almost anyone. In the Souls franchise, lore is typically presented through deep and complex worlds that you explore, as well as a broad and obscure narrative video at the beginning, all supplemented by item descriptions and character interactions. However, Shadow Tower Abyss and the other FromSoft games of the time keep a lot of their in their game manuals and strategy guides. so most people, even those who have played the English translation of the game, may not even know what the hell is going on in the world of Shadow Tower Abyss. But luckily, like the original game manual, I was also able to find a scan of the original Japanese strategy guide that provides good descriptions of all the enemies, areas, items, and full lore backstory from the game. Usually I would put these scans through an image-to-text converter and translate the Japanese text output with DeepL. Alternatively, you could use Google Image Translate, but I found it to be much worse. These methods are far from perfect, but usually good enough, and you can use this method to translate other language-locked game manuals to at least be somewhat understandable. I'll try to summarize what the translation says, but keep in mind this is a very imprecise method of translating, so take any translations I give you with a grain of salt. All the events of this lore happen over an indeterminate amount of time. Almost every event is described as having happened over some long time period, and some events would indicate they may have happened over thousands, if not millions of years. The tower we all know and love is actually a giant plant hive mind being that used to exist in an alternate world, according to the guide. The creatures of this other world relied on these plants to provide them with energy that keeps them alive, and likewise, the plants rely on the energy from the creatures as well. The plants' main goal then is to maintain the equilibrium they've established in this ecosystem between them and all the other forms of life that depend on them. One day, there was some sort of crisis that threatened the plants' lives, so to avoid this, the plants reverted back to what the guide calls their seed or species form, depending on the translation. Basically, they form into what we know as the tower and fling themselves off into the abyss. While flying through the abyss, the plant's propulsion organ ends up completely failing. So after drifting through the abyss for a long time, it eventually finds itself being drawn in and landing in our world. The way all these terms are used seems to sound like we're talking about an alien being that split off from another planet and flew through space before crash landing on Earth. This is further backed up by the fact the strategy guide has a diagram of the tower and gives details about it with certain ship-like functionalities, as well as showing what it looks like in flight mode. Honestly, I find this outer space lore to be a little disappointing from what I originally thought of the game, but after reading it all in detail, I can't come to any other conclusion about it. Anyways, after landing on Earth, it tries to root itself into the ground, but can't as the roots keep dying out. The plants determine after some time that the light from the sun is slowly killing them, and was also the cause for its propulsion systems failing. And since that propulsion system has failed and the sun continues to damage them, the plants realize they can't leave Earth. A long period of time passes from when the plants crash land, and they come to realize that they're running out of the energy they need to sustain the life of the creatures inside the tower. Luckily, eventually a new form of creature, likely via evolution, ends up entering the tower. Apparently this new form of creature was much more complex than any before it, so the plants get the idea that if they can fuse with this creature and create a new form of life, they can survive on Earth and sustain the lives of the creatures that rely on them. So the plant commanded what is described as the Wise One within itself to capture these creatures and fuse with them. Unfortunately for the plants, this experimental fusion fails and the portions of the plant that are fused have to detach and separate. For now, the plants have to wait a long time for some other beings to come along they can try and fuse with instead. Over time, humans go through their evolutionary history all the way up to the point that nations rise and fall. Eventually, the king of a human nation ventures into what look like ruins, but is actually the tower itself. According to the description, humans are apparently the evolved form of whatever kind of creature the plants tried to fuse with in the past. So the plants recognize this and take the king and the other humans who invade and begin fusing with them. This is the point where the plants command the Wise One referenced before to create a tool similar to the one used by the humans they're fusing with. This tool would provide great magical power and communicate the will of the plants to whoever wields it. And so the spear was created and given to the king, who becomes the Spear King as we know him. In return, the plants require the king to provide a constant flow of humans so they can experiment with fusion over time. This is why our protagonist ends up getting trapped later on, or given his offerings as part of this continued ritual sacrifice. Anyway, over the course of some decades, the Spear King uses the power of the spear to build a great empire, but eventually the plants stop communicating with the king through the spear, apparently due to the new creatures known as spawn being formed from all of the fusion experiments the plants are running. The guide doesn't explain how or why these spawn, or orphan creatures as the translation calls them, end up causing the communication to end. But as a result, the king grew old and frail, as well as increasingly anxious as he waited for the plants to finally communicate with him again. One day, the king returns back to the tower believing that he finally heard from the spear again, but the guide specifically says that it's not clear whether he really heard them or if he was just being delusional. Before the king goes deep into the tower, he tells his people to keep the offerings to the tower going until he finally returns. But as we know now, he never does. Now, coming into the modern times, the ruins of the king's old civilization were discovered, and an organization was founded to explore them. Our main character is a mercenary hired as a guard for the archaeologists exploring the area. We're tricked by the promises of treasure in the ruins by an old man holding to the demand of the Spear King to continue sacrificing people as offerings. And so we find ourselves trapped by the roots of the tower, and the game begins. Honestly, looking back at the game now, I wish I had known all this prior to playing it. It would have made the world and the goal of trying to make sense of things much more enjoyable and satisfying. As we go along through the game, I'll try to piece things together and make sense of it all. So, with all of that out of the way, we could finally continue. According to one of the Rofus, they're beings from the abyss who are also trapped in the tower. Presumably while the tower was flying through space, these creatures were picked up along the way and became trapped. Most of the rest of them just give us some obscure version of the lore I just went through. But one of them tells you there are 7 beings that are called lords due to their power. And if we want to have power too, we should destroy them and become the destroyer. Now where have I heard that plot before? Honestly, this concept of becoming a destroyer is only mentioned this one time, so I find the whole idea really weird. I actually forgot this was even said until I looked back at the dialogue again while editing this video. Anyway, what else is around here? So in one of these rooms we see a... Whoa. Let's see what she has to say. Oh, I guess she's not really into humans. That's a shame. But she is into power apparently. She asks you to obtain power and gives you a key to progress. Well, it's better than nothing, I guess. There's one of each of the colored stations I mentioned before here in the 2 side doors. You can come back here anytime until the end of the game to restock or store items or whatever you need to do. So after doing all that, I head down the main path to a locked door and use the key Rurifon gives me and head on in. There are 3 doors here. One leads to an elevator that takes us up further in the tower, and the other 2 lead to 2 different areas we can access. We have to complete the areas on this floor first to go up the elevator. So I pick one and head in. By the way, all the names of these areas come directly from the in-game English translation. I'm not making any of these up. As we head into the insect area, immediately to our right is a locked Junji Ito-style spiral door with a set of 2 glowy shapes at the top. So we head down the other path and fight off some bugs, which are known as Raldos. They're generally not very difficult to fight. Cutting off their heads doesn't insta-kill them, but cutting off their legs limits their quick movements, making it easier to take them out. Otherwise, they can move pretty fast and avoid your attacks sometimes. One drops the insect fang item, whose shape matches the glowy parts of the locked door from before. Now that we have this item, we're able to pass through any door with those fang shapes above them from now on. This area has many types of these doors, and as we progress through, we'll need to search for these different insect-based keys to open them. Heading into the room, we see some husks of dead bugs, which you can hit and will sometimes drop items, which is pretty neat, albeit kinda gross. But that's all for this room, so now what? We head back into the hall where we killed the bugs before. One thing to note is enemies sometimes respawn in this game. Not all of them, but just enough later on to cause you to have to deal with them as you backtrack through areas. I killed the bugs again, and eventually I realized I should try breaking the wall, which works and I'm able to pass by. This is the first time that the developers use an unavoidable obstacle to teach us a base mechanic. This teaches you there are portions of the game where breaking walls is not only an option, but sometimes necessary. The breakable wall in the forest area from before was optional, but this one is not. In the next room, there are some gross bug eggs scattered throughout, but one has some cues, so that's nice. This also lets you know to try and break the eggs to see if there are any items inside. So we'll keep that in mind as we continue along. So I continue on, going through another room down a hallway filled with more bugs and more eggs, until I come across this guy. He tells us there's an insect hive ahead, and there's a light that protects the Lord inside, and he must defeat it to go any further. It turns out the Spear King was his master, and they both traveled to the tower together, and he's been trapped here for however many decades or centuries since they first entered, which would seem to imply you don't age while you're in the tower. I'm not so sure if I'm misunderstanding this, but we don't really hear this point made for the rest of the game, so I'm not sure what this is really about. Anyway, he's here to try and find the spear to restore his empire, which, as we know, no longer exists. But instead of telling them that, we just move on to the hive just ahead. Entering in, the supposed bug lord just tells us to fuck off, so I try shooting the light, but no dice. It turns out we have to make our way through the entire area to find the source of the light and destroy it. So I enter into the room and fight off all the bugs inside while avoiding the queen's spit attacks. After killing the bugs, I pass by the queen into the side hall. One of the branches off this hall leads to an ant spraying what looks like the gooey substance from the cocoon room from earlier on the walls. It's quite interesting to see the creatures of this area just doing stuff on their own, rather than focusing solely on attacking you. At one point, I come across a room filled with a lot of eggs. Let me give you some advice, because I didn't realize this at the time until I had come back to this room later. Items are hard to see. And just like with all the eggs in this room, sometimes you need to press the interact button on things even if you don't see an item nearby, because there might actually be. This also applies to any dead bodies you find, which can contain items that aren't outwardly visible. So make sure to always check. A bit later, I ended up coming across the corpses of yellow bugs that look much different than the ones I've been fighting, as well as a pair of worker bugs carrying one down a path. This path leads to a tall cave system that looks very different from the rest of the area, where a group of red and yellow bugs are fighting each other. These moments, like the ant spraying the goo at the wall, are examples of how FromSoft is great at creating areas that feel like they're really alive with activity outside of the context of being in a video game. You're there to witness things as they come to you, because this world exists regardless of whether you're there to witness it or not. This kind of thing is crucial to the FromSoftware method of world design. This is something that could warrant its own video entirely, but that's for another time. Still, I'm not exactly sure what the implications or reasoning for this conflict between the two insect factions are exactly. We never really seem to get much of an explanation, but it definitely makes you wonder what exactly is going on. Anyway, I kill off the stragglers from the Great Bug War, and in the next room I come across the first flying enemy of the game. Now me, being as stubborn as I am, wanted to kill these with a melee weapon and conserve my ammo, making it a tedious pain in the ass to kill these things. But the design of this area is very well set up for that. Yeah, you could pull out your pistol and shoot them if you want, but if you're out of ammo, FromSoft puts a big pit in the middle of the room that you have to carefully dance around while fighting off the enemies. This creates a great little dynamic in the combat in this particular area that really makes it stand out. It's these little moments of complex situations that really keep this game from becoming too stale as you play through. After killing all the enemies and picking up all the gear, I end up finding my first soul pot, which is an item that lets you increase one stat by +5. Now's probably a good time to finally explain the leveling and stat mechanics of this game. I've seen quite a few different reviews of Shadow Tower Abyss, and one thing I hear mentioned frequently is how no one has any idea how the stat system works. Stamina, vitality, strength, and dexterity are all pretty familiar. Slash, break, and pierce are obviously damage types, and we also have magic of course, but we also have concentration, mentality, mind, and what the hell is element, solvent, and spirit? Like I mentioned at the beginning, there were no guides for this game at the time of playing it, so I found the original Japanese manual online and translated it for the purposes of this video. And also mentioned before, I created a simple guide on GameFAQs for everything I'm about to mention here. So here's the breakdown. Stamina increases your max HP, Vitality affects slash resistance and weapon gauge count, Strength affects break resistance, Dexterity affects pierce resistance and weapon gauge speed, which is how quickly your weapon gauge refills, Magic increases your max MP, Concentration affects element resistance and magic gauge speed, Mentality affects solvent resistance and debuff chance, Mind affects spirit resistance, magic gauge count, and debuff duration. Slash is for slashing damage, which is when you swing left and right. Break is for break damage, which is the overhead swing. And pierce is for piercing damage, which is the stab attack. Element is for fire and ice magic damage. Solvent is for poison and acid magic damage. And spirit is for holy and dark magic damage. Really, the stat system is actually very simple once someone can actually tell you what the hell any of it means. Something the manual doesn't adequately mention is how increasing stats works. Shadow Tower Abyss has no leveling system. Apparently, according to the manual, your stats slowly increase as you kill enemies. I didn't realize this at all until I translated it, because the change is so small compared to the stat increases you get from picking up new weapons or armor that it doesn't even compare. Besides killing enemies and equipping new gear, you can also increase your stats directly using the soul pots. You can really see the similarities with Dark Souls and Demon Souls using souls to increase stats. You find these around the game world, and you can use them to increase your stats by +5 for normal soul pots and +20 for the rare black soul pots. You can't use them to increase your damage stats such as slash or solvent, but you can increase all the rest. There's a limited amount of soul pots in the game world, so if you plan to spend them, do so wisely. I personally never used any of the soul pots I found, except to increase my max HP and weight when I was over encumbered and pretty far from an item station. More on how total weight works later. So presumably you just get an increase in what those stats provide, right? You would think increasing strength just gives you resistance against break damage. Nope, not at all actually. What happens when a particular stat is increased isn't covered by the manual or guide at all. All of the following info comes purely from user testing. So thanks to Allison by proxy for posting the results of their testing on a YouTube comment I found on Aether Aesthetics' Shadow Tower Abyss video. I recommend checking them both out. Aether Aesthetic in particular has quite a few videos on the older FromSoftware games, where he does more direct comparisons between the original Shadow Tower, Abyss, and the Kingsfield games. Anyway, here's what you need to know. When increasing your stats, they affect the things I mentioned before, but they also have some other minor effects. Increasing your stamina increases your max HP and your max weight. Increasing vitality, strength, and dexterity each increase their respective resistances, but also slightly increase some of your physical damage stats as well as your max HP and weight. Increasing your magic only increases your max MP. Increasing concentration, mentality, and mind each increase their respective resistances, but also slightly increase your magic damage stats as well as your max MP. Ultimately, these minor boosts are pretty negligible and were never something I paid any attention to outside of increasing vitality from weapon swings and stamina for more health and carry weight. But if you want to seriously min-max this game for some reason, now you know. With all of that out of the way, there's not really much left to talk about in this area. I go through more rooms, kill more bugs, and get new keys to open various doors with bug shapes attached to them. This eventually comes to an end when I approach the final room with the light making the Bug Lord invincible. So I go in, shoot the light, and head back down to the Bug Lord's room. And in one single shot, the Bug Lord talks some shit, but immediately dies. Honestly, I'm disappointed there wasn't a cool boss fight here. But we get our first ring, and that lets us shoot a fire dart as a magic spell, which is pretty cool. Now's a good time to quickly explain how magic works. The magic gauge works similarly to the weapon gauge. Each blue orb represents how many casts of the spell you could use in combat. Once you use all the casts up, you have to wait a few seconds to cast again. But there are some differences to melee. For one, you have an MP bar just under your HP bar that indicates how much MP you have left. Each spell uses a certain amount of MP that really isn't mentioned anywhere as far as I can tell. But more importantly is the way you cast spells. You equip a spell by equipping a ring. Each ring gives their own stat increases, as well as a single spell tied to the ring. Equipping the Ruby Wing gives you access to a Fire Dart spell and increases your element stat by plus 40, but you can also see it has a durability of 17. Ring durability is crucial to how magic works. Each cast of a spell from a ring uses up 1 durability. This is very important to remember because once you use up all the casts, if you let the ring drop to 0 durability, it will break, making it very difficult to repair and continue using. This actually creates some really nice tension in the gameplay later on, where magic becomes more necessary and relevant. So while it may seem annoying in concept, in practice I actually quite enjoyed the dynamic it created in certain areas and situations. Anyway, so I make a quick detour to tell our tribal friend that he can move on, and yeah, he has nothing new to say to us. Well, you're welcome there, buddy. A thank you would have been nice. Anyway, heading past the doorway the Bug Lord was blocking, I find something called a purity crystal that radiates holy light that purifies all poisons. Uh-oh. Continuing on, we come to another marked door, leading us to a FromSoftware certified hood classic. Yeah, this is definitely one of the more horrifying transitions we get for sure. You're immediately introduced to this weird worm creature known as a Vom, crawling by 2 hands at his front and noxious purple gas filling in the room. Cutting off the tail of the Vom sometimes split off into smaller versions that will also attack you, which means you need to focus on the head to kill it as easily as possible. This is a nice usage of the dismemberment mechanic against the player. Killing these smaller enemies cut off the main body will then spawn a small grub enemy that you also have to kill. Other than the enemies in this room, there are some holes you can drop down. This whole area plays a lot with verticality, and these holes create paths you have to commit to anytime you want to progress. Normally with a door you can just go back, but if you drop into a hole, you're committed to your decision. To top it off, you're constantly being poisoned to death, so if you want to make it through, your decisions need to be quick. This creates a strong feeling of tension as you progress through the area, just trying to complete all of it. If you drop down one hole, you might be swarmed by 3 Voms, but in another you might end up going down a path that leads to a nice item, but ultimately you end up right back where you were. All of this would make this area really intense, if not for the fact the shop has a piece of armor that gives you Poison Null, which completely removes the poison issue altogether. Honestly, in hindsight, it was a little disappointing because traversing through this area became a lot less intense after equipping this. You still get the tension of having to decide which hole to drop down, but you're able to think it through and decide since you're not really short on time. Anyway, so I head down one of the holes and I immediately see these little plinths with a space to put the purity crystal I found from before, clearing up the poison from this room. But now I've come to realize that I'm stuck. There's no way up and no doorways anywhere, but I do notice a marking on one of the walls, so I try walking up and interacting with it, and what do you know? It's a hidden door. This is the first time the game introduces us to the concept of hidden doors. So not only does Shadow Tower Abyss have breakable walls, but it also has these interactable hidden doors that can lead us to new areas and often really good loot. Keep this in mind because if you want 100% every area, you're going to have to interact with every single damn wall. Spoiler alert, I don't end up doing that for this playthrough. In the next room there are corpses hanging from the ceiling. You can actually shoot these and they'll fall down and drop loot, which is a nice touch. It seems like most areas in Shadow Tower Abyss have some form of breakable thing you can get loot from. There's a large writing in blood on the wall that tells us this seems to be a purification facility, and if we use the purity crystals and clear up all the poison, we can find something. So, with that goal in mind, we continue on to the next room with a save point and a shop. After saving and buying the Poison Null chest piece, I eventually make my way out to the central room of this area. There are 3 doors across from you and a big open space below filled with poison and a Vom. On the left wall is a giant pipe that sprays out the poison water into this area, and just below that is a unique looking doorway that we'll come back to later. If you try to drop down now, you die. One of the 3 doors actually leads to the other area we could have gone back to in the hub, which is pretty cool. You could have gone down either path from the hub and eventually reach the poison area, where you actually end up getting a key to open up the boss room for this new area. Shadow Tower Abyss isn't a very open game, but this little bit of choice to what flavor of linearity you want is pretty nice, and surprising for the time. I spend the rest of my time in the area dropping down paths, killing some enemies, grabbing loot, purifying the waters with the crystals I find, rinse and repeat. Most of the paths loop back on each other and lead either back to the save room or the main open room. After some time, I place all the purity crystals and the water in the main room is finally all clear. Now we can drop down, kill the nearby Vom, and access the final door of the area. Heading inside, I read some esoteric blood message. And damn, our tribal homie's dead. Rest in pieces, pal. Maybe you should have thanked me for helping you out instead of running off to die. Scattered around the room are some nice loot items on the ground and in pots, including the Triple Bless bracelet, which gives us a fantastic poison, blind, and paralyzed null effect when wearing it. In the middle of the room is a blue stone that acts as a key for the boss room of the next area. I pick it up and get swarmed by the little Vom grubs, which honestly hurt more than I expected. But with them dead and this area complete, we can finally head back up and move on to... Unfortunately, this area feels a bit short, but what it lacks in time spent, it makes up for in some great design choices. Throughout the area are these cyclopean creatures running around that shoot fire and ice magic at you. But some of them that you come across just kind of stand around and don't do anything. So I try interacting with them, and they're actually NPCs like the ones back in the hub area that will talk to you and tell you things. Some of them tell you to challenge the boss and talk about how strong he is, while another says this. Creepy. Anyway, heading through this area, you fight off big and small versions of these creatures, which are known as Mordors. Every area in the Shadow Tower Abyss has a max of 1 or 2 enemy types, with slight variations between them. These variations do actually make a difference in how they fight, but aesthetically it's a little disappointing to see the same kind of creature over and over again. But what the game lacks in enemy diversity within areas, it makes up for between the different areas. Speaking of the boss from before though, as you're progressing through the area, you'll hear a loud roar echo throughout the caverns. And all the enemies you're fighting will suddenly cower in fear. This, along with the fact that some enemies are actually NPCs you can speak to, are more examples of that immersive world building that FromSoft is so good at. Eventually I reach a room where there are 3 different doors I can use my blue key from the previous area on. Each one leads to a slightly different path that requires you to fight all the enemies down a long hallway. After making my way through that, I come to the boss of the wide area. This one's an actual fight, and a pretty decent one. This giant lion-like creature jumps around, avoiding your attacks and jumping over you while hitting you for damage. He also spits fireballs every now and then. After hitting him a few times, his main breaks apart. Though I'm not exactly sure what this does, I think it removes his ability to cast fireballs. I start out by shooting him a lot with my revolver, breaking his main, and then deciding to try and finish him off with my knife. This takes a little while, and I almost die a few times as he keeps jumping all over the place. And just as I'm about to finish him, he hits me with gravity, which is a debuff that slows you down as if you're over encumbered. But that doesn't stop me, and after a few more swings, he's down. Now that we have the Amber Lift key, we can return back to the hub area and continue on, but not before heading to the back of the boss room to open up a chest containing our second ring, the Set Sapphire, which allows us to summon ice pillars as a magical attack. From here, it takes me a long time to find my way to the entrance to the hub. This is a pretty common problem I ran into while playing the game, and it made me spend way longer in certain areas than I ever should have. I wish that bits of the areas were more distinct so you could have a better sense of where you even are or where things are relative to each other. But eventually I do make it back to the blue light area where Rurufan waits for us. She tells us apparently someone has stolen her things and asks if we can help find them and return her stuff back to her. Funny how she's not talking shit anymore now that she needs our help. Anyway, I head back down to the hub to repair my gear, buy any items I may need, and save my game before heading back up to the elevator with the new key we got. This area is basically just like the one below. Another elevator up with a blue key slot and 2 doors leading to 2 different paths. Except this time, one path leads to the next area, and the other path just leads to a slope up that you can't even reach. This is the exit we'll come out of once we complete the next area. So, heading into the next zone, this is one of my favorite transitions. Take a look. This is one of my favorite moments that really solidified my desire to complete Shadow Tower Abyss. This goes back to the whole point about transitions I made earlier. Honestly, I'm not really sure that the excitement you would feel from transitioning from area to area communicates well over video. But for me, finally knowing I'm done with the current level I'm in, and the anticipation of wanting to know what will be behind the marked doors, really got me hyped to take on yet another unique adventure in the tower. So, let's talk about what awaits in the Scouring Rush. This area has a number of familiar creatures we've already seen, Galps, Raldos, and so on, each fitted with a gross parasite on some portion of their body, and to kill them you have to target the parasite. Once again, this is another great way of utilizing the dismemberment mechanic to make combat a lot more interesting. Though I still wish there were more varieties of enemy models, it feels like this game utilized a lot of recycling and is pretty disappointing. Anyway, apparently these parasites are known as Balaferma. They're a race of giant plants that implant themselves in other creatures to control them. So I assume these are some sort of manifestation of the plants that make up the tower, and maybe their parasitic form is the fusion that was referenced before. But it's hard to say for sure because you only ever really see them in this one area. These could be creatures that they tried to fuse with, but had to split away from, so maybe they're being forced into this single area. There are also Balaferma in their non-parasitic form. There are these flower enemies that sprout up from the ground in a stalk and shoot purple laser beams at you. To kill them, you have to attack the very base of their stalk to cut off the top portion, then you have to kill the bit of stalk left over within a few seconds. If you don't, the flower will grow back and beat the shit out of you. But if you get close to them with a melee weapon, they swing their body in an arc in front of them to melee you. Usually you can walk around them if you bait their attacks, but if you can't, you'll have to shoot them or use magic at a distance. And last but not least are these other plants with eyeballs that are sprouting out of the tentacles spread throughout the level. They spray some kind of harmful gas into the air that will damage you if you get near them. Best to stay at a distance and hit them, or just wait for the short period between their gas to melee them. Heading through, almost every room is a square shape connected by halls and doors. After the first few rooms, you come to a big open chamber with massive tentacles sprouting up from the depths below. And there are pathways along the walls leading to separate doorways and paths that we'll reach later on. One thing I haven't mentioned yet are the maps of these areas. There's no map menu in Shadow Tower Abyss, but in almost every area in the game, there are typically rough maps of where your objectives are drawn out on walls. They'll tell you where you are by this marking, and anything of interest will usually be marked by red dots or X's or something like that. So, heading down the path along the wall leads to a series of halls and rooms. I travel through, defeating enemies along the way and picking up loot, until I come to this room, where the very first iteration of the sneaky Patches character makes his first appearance. For anyone who doesn't know, Patches is a popular recurring character in FromSoft's games as an NPC that tricks the player into some trap that is extremely deadly, typically so he can steal items from your body or something along those lines. At the time, I didn't actually realize he was Patches since he doesn't look anything like the normal Patches we know and love, and nothing says his name at any point. Luckily, I created a save state before giving him 5 Qn to see what I'll get for it. Heading inside the room, there's a dead body and a message written in blood saying, "He's crazy. He thinks everyone is an enemy. With the spear, you can escape and..." The message cuts off there. Looking around the room, there's nothing actually here except a bunch of empty chests. Except this one. This is the moment where I realized what just happened. It was honestly a mixture of shock and satisfaction at the realization that I had genuinely fallen for one of Patch's traps once again, even going all the way back to 2003. The explosion seemed to do just enough damage not to kill you, like most of Patch's traps. So I heal up and head back out to enact my revenge. But he's gone, though it won't be the last we see of him. But what if you decide to kill him instead of giving him the 5 Qn to get his key? He drops this strange blue rock thing called a Cursed Longing. It turns out that Patches was the man Rurifon mentioned before that stole her items. And if you decide to kill him and go back to the Blue Light Hub area and give her the Cursed Longing, this happens. Just a single soul pot, not even a black one. But you still get to see some extra dialogue from Rurifon, which is pretty neat. I'm not sure if there are some other consequences of doing this for her. I chose to keep my save where Patches betrays us for some stuff you'll see later on. I'd be curious to see if anyone in the comments knows. Anyway, after continuing to explore for a while, I come across a reddish plant tentacle blocking the way. There are quite a few of these throughout the area that are blocking off access to different rooms and shortcuts, so take note of where these are for later. At another point, I eventually come across a ladder leading down into a tunnel that connects 2 halves of the Scouring Rush. Pretty often I found myself looking for a specific room without even realizing it's not in this half of the map, so keep that in mind if you decide to backtrack a lot like I needed to. Eventually I found my way down a hall with one of those globe-like points similar to our save or shop points. Except this one is white, and when you interact with it, it teleports you to another one at some other point in the map. This one leads you right to the boss of the Scouring Rush. This leads us to the very bottom of the main chamber, where all the large tentacles are sprouting up and throughout the area. In the center is the plant lord itself, which is a giant eyeball surrounded by shielding petals that close when you try to hit it, and there are nearby Balaferma flowers shooting at you if you try to get too close. Honestly, this, like most bosses in the game, is kind of a joke. Walk around behind the flowers to take them out, then when the boss opens up its petals to reveal its eye, attack the petals to remove them and finish the boss by attacking the eyeball. So this is the point of the video where I point out what I think is this game's biggest issue. Shadow Tower Abyss is an extremely easy game. Most of the difficulty of the game lies in brief moments where there's enough going on that you happen to die before you can even react. In my case, I died more from accidentally falling into death pits than I ever did from enemies' attacks. The game is pretty trivial in regards to combat. I intentionally tried to use melee as much as possible up until the last quarter of the game or so, but even when forcing myself to use melee, it's still just way too easy. The problem is that you pick up powerful new gear so often that none of the enemies can really pose much of a threat. Granted, the benefit of this is a constant hit of dopamine whenever you get a nice shiny new piece of armor that has a glowing face on the dick. Not to mention the fact that you basically always have enough health potions to be invincible. And all that might be bad, but at least FromSoft could challenge the player with truly difficult boss fights, but they don't. Every boss fight is a complete joke. The boss fights themselves are cool and fit very well thematically in their respective areas, but that's all completely marred by the fact you could stomp them into the dirt on your first try in less than 2 minutes. And starting from this area, you get the AR-15, which is a devastating weapon. It holds something like 20 bullets and does a shitload of damage without you ever needing to get close. And you can buy a good bit of ammo for it at the store for very cheap. In my opinion, what this game needs more than anything else is more difficulty, which is pretty ironic coming from FromSoft, who are infamous for making notoriously difficult and mechanically complex enemies and boss fights. Maybe one day someone can do some sort of ROM hack or something to make the game harder. That would definitely be worth playing if done well. So I easily take out the Plant Lord boss, and now all of the red tentacles blocking the paths before are open to us. Nice. Now this is the point where I spend way too long backtracking and wandering around through this area, walking in circles, looking for everything I can find. Instead of going through all that, here's what I'll say about the Scouring Rush that also applies to all areas in the game. There are a lot of hidden doors. This is the first area in the game where I realized just how many secrets there are. I accidentally found a secret path that did not stick out at all from the rest of the wall, and that made me realize I had probably been totally missing out on a bunch of secrets the entire time I've been playing up to this point. And as I was backtracking through the area to look for more secrets, I started to realize something. I would circle back to rooms where I had killed everything around me, but I would still hear enemies behind walls nearby. This is a pretty big aha moment for me. For example, there's a room in this area with a repair and save point. I could hear enemies through the nearby wall and realized, wait, there aren't any rooms there. Maybe there's a secret. I had heard various noises as I went through each area and just assumed it was all ambience or would be a room I'd eventually find my way to. If you find yourself in a room and you still hear enemies nearby, but you know you've cleared out all the main rooms in the entire area, you're probably near a secret path. So, back in this room where I can hear some enemies, I check around the walls nearby and... yep. There was a secret wall right there that I had walked past ages ago. Now I obviously didn't find all the secrets in the game, but there's one I'll share because in this particular area, it leads down quite a long path with some really interesting stuff in it. Down the hallway with the red light just before the boss door, you can hear a ton of enemies from behind a nearby wall. If you interact with this wall here, it leads you down a very long path of multiple rooms. You can feel free to explore those, but there's another hidden door in one of these secret rooms. You'll come to a room filled with some more plant enemies and a blue light. If you interact with the wall nearby here, you get access to a really cool little secret area of the Scouring Rush that contains some great gear and an enemy we haven't seen before. Now I haven't spent too much time talking about the gear I've been picking up because there's so much of it and talking about it would be pretty boring and repetitive. But let me show you what a typical piece of gear you might find looks like versus just some of what I found going down this path. Here's some gear I picked up normally. And here's what I found in this secret area. You get a bunch of AR-15 mags, grenades for a grenade launcher, a really strong revolver, our very first black soul pot which gives plus 20 instead of plus 5 to stats, a bunch of Qun from all the secret enemies we found, and quite a few other things. As I mentioned before, the databook will tell you what % completion you have in each area, so check it to know if you're still missing some stuff if you want to go for 100% completion. But after grabbing all that loot and finding all these secrets, I run into one of the biggest true enemies of Shadow Tower Abyss. Fucking item weight. This is why I actually ended up spending so much time in this area. It's not just because there are so many secrets, but because being over encumbered in this game makes everything take forever. Since you have a total weight, as I mentioned before, and each item in the game has a certain weight, as you pick up items, especially weapons and armor, your weight increases. So if you go over your total weight, you're hit with a burden status, which basically works just like the typical Skyrim weight limit, where you move very slowly. But in Shadow Tower Abyss, each status effect that you can be hit by actually has 2 stages. You can recognize this for yourself. If you open up your menu, you can see your current status effect. If the text is white, it's stage 1. If it's red, you're stage 2. I'm not sure exactly what stage 2 means for each status effect, but for Burden, it means you move even slower than stage 1 and take damage over time. But no big deal, right? Just drop some stuff. Clearly you're holding a bunch of junk you probably don't need anyway. Yeah, except you can't. Shadow Tower Abyss has no item drop option. So, if you find yourself in a situation where you happen to pick up a chest piece that makes you go over your total weight, you have to slowly crawl your stupid ass all the way back to a heal point to burn up items or to a shop to store or sell them. In my opinion, this is where the real use of the soul pots comes in. As I said before, this game is tragically easy, so you never really need soul pots for increasing anything except your stamina for total weight or vitality for the weapon gauge. Something that's only ever mentioned in the game manual is the fact that total weight scales off your HP. This is a pretty important thing to remember, and I don't think anyone who hasn't translated the manual is aware of this. So anytime you want to increase your total weight, you should do anything you can to increase your max HP. The easiest way to do this is increase your stamina stat with soul pots or different gear. Along the way during my journey back and forth over and over through the Scouring Rush, I came across 2 separate marked doors leading to new areas. One of them is required and leads you to the next lift key, and the other is a totally optional area. But we ain't skipping out on nothing, so we're gonna make our way to... Ah, well look who it is. Let's see what old Patches has to say. It wouldn't really be Patches if we didn't encounter him again talking shit and telling us if we don't hurt him, he'll give us something good. You know, I think he's probably learned from his crimes. I trust him. Yep, that checks out. So the Waterfall Area takes place half the time underwater, and you don't actually have to worry about suffocating, which I find pretty surprising. While you're in the water, there are semi-transparent fish creatures called Birash, and they are difficult. Honestly, considering I was complaining about balance before, this is a breath of fresh air, no pun intended. But these guys move from the realm of difficult to just fucking annoying. Very often when fighting them, they'll swim towards you, deal some damage, and then back away just before you can hit back. Or they swim past, damaging you as they go by. And since you're in water, you turn and move a lot slower than you do on land, so turning to attack them is pointless. They'll be gone by the time you're done turning and ready to attack. Sometimes though, they just stay still without moving for a few seconds, and that's your chance to land a few good hits, which with my current weapons is all it takes to take them down. The other enemies in this area are these dinosaur creatures called Grundum that have their heads split open, revealing a creepy eye as they run at you. There are also much bigger versions of these that can be pretty intimidating, but they're pretty easy to deal with. Just avoid them rushing at you and beat them down with melee or shoot them at a distance, and you're good. So after killing the fish in the water, grabbing some items, and heading out into the cave path, it's actually quite a nice looking area. It's very naturalistic and familiar again to contrast against the severe alienness of the Scouring Rush and Blue Light area. But it's also contrasted with the hell you suffer if you accidentally fall into any of the pitfall traps around the area. Luckily, they're pretty easy to spot and avoid, which I recommend, at least for now. If you continue through the caves, you'll reach a room with a repair point and these weird egg sacs on the ceiling. If you shoot them, they give an animation of dropping eggs, but they don't seem to do anything. But more importantly, if you go to the end of the cave past all the pitfalls, you get something that makes traversing this area a lot easier. The Life Vest. Once again, if you play this game, take the time to actually look at the data screen of the gear you pick up. I played like half this area before I actually looked at the obvious thing that literally says it is a life vest, so it is probably important item. Anyway, the life vest gives you unimpeded movement underwater, so you turn and walk at the same speed you would as if you were on land. This makes fighting those fishy bastards a lot easier, so even though you'll have less defense, I recommend it. When you drop into the water to get the life vest, you're swarmed by a group of the giant dinosaurs, and they hurt. But after quickly taking them out, you can head through the underwater paths now. I recommend heading back the direction where all the pitfalls were to get all the items there, including a sword that heals you when you attack, which remains useful for quite a long time. Also, as you head back, you'll notice some underwater jet streams that slowly pull you into death pits. These are mostly harmless, so as long as you keep moving, just stay clear of them and you should be fine. After you go back and collect everything, you can find a breakable wall that leads you up and out of the water to this area's namesake. I really like this area quite a lot. There's something very surreal and dreamy about the misty water of this area flowing all around you in this ravine. This is definitely one of the more beautiful areas in the game, and it's a pleasure to walk through, even if the enemies here can be pretty brutal. Speaking of enemies, there are little spaces behind the waterfalls that house those dinosaur enemies, so be careful as you walk through. There are ruins throughout the waterfall area that block off paths, and you have to find your way around them. Behind some of them are items that you want to get, as well as some paths down into the water that can connect to other parts of the waterfall area that are blocked off. So if you come across any holes down to the underwater portion, make sure to explore around in there to access the other areas of the map. It's mostly a lot of exploring and fighting fish and dinosaurs from this point, so after some time you'll find a path that leads you all the way back to where Patches dropped you in before, and you can head back to the Scouring Rush. Yep, that's it. There's no boss fight, no key item, or anything to get as far as I'm aware. The entire point of this area is for it to be a place you're forced to navigate if Patches decides to fuck you over, which is honestly pretty hilarious. This is one of the more brutal versions of Patches that FromSoft has ever put out, and I love the boldness. But yeah, we're definitely gonna have to get revenge on his ass. So now that we're done with that, there's still another path out of the Scouring Rush that leads us to the actual next area, which is... Man, the Cliff World's transition was such a stark contrast from everything that has come before. And luckily for us, that trend's going to continue going forward. This area aesthetically is quite awesome, and it introduces a whole new dynamic of interacting with enemies in the environment that feels different from the rest of the locations in the game. The whole thing takes place in a path through this ravine with tall walls all around you. Besides these paths, there are some standalone platforms out by themselves, and some paths cut into the walls of the cliff faces that you can walk through to get to different parts of the ravine. As for enemies, there's flying bird-like creatures known as Balava, and they're weird baby versions that don't seem to do much of anything. The normal Balava fly around, and if you get close, they fly at you, doing damage. This is the point in the game where you should have enough AR-15 or M14 ammo that you could just blast away at these things without them ever even touching you. If you decide to use a gun, you can go for headshots, but I really like that the developers put in the ability to shoot off their wings with a dismemberment mechanic. This forces them to fall either to the depths below or to the ground where you can finish them off with melee if you want. It's yet another great use of a base mechanic this game provides, and I'm really glad to see it not just be an afterthought. It feels properly integrated from start to finish. As for the babies, they kind of just sit there and cry. Some of them are out on the standalone platforms that you can't access, which gives me the impression that those are supposed to be nests. I'm not sure exactly why these baby creatures were put in the game this way, but it definitely gives this place a certain kind of realism to the life cycle of these creatures. It ends up feeling like a real self-sustaining ecosystem. Anyway, despite the guns making it very easy to make your way through this area, there's actually a certain satisfaction that comes from trying to land shots on the Balava from far away with a gun that has no reticle. You're basically just shooting relative to the center of your screen if you don't have any built-in crosshair function on your monitor. And if you actually owned this back in the PS2 days, you would just be trying to aim blind from the center of your TV. But it's pretty fun to try and land headshots on these birds from halfway across the map. It brings me back to the old COD days, at least just for a moment. As for traversing the area itself, there's not really much else to talk about here. It's a pretty linear path, so just keep going forward and you'll eventually find the way to the boss. There's very little in the way of interesting paths or backtracking or anything like that, which is honestly a little disappointing. But around this time, it was just fun enough to shoot the wings off birds for about 20 minutes, so I don't mind. Anyway, now comes one of the most disappointing bits in the entire game. This boss fight, once again, is a complete joke. I'm just going to show you the entire thing start to finish unedited so you can see what I mean. "20 seconds. That's how long that boss fight was. 20 seconds for what I honestly thought was a great looking arena and boss aesthetic for this area. This is exactly what I'm talking about when I say this game has severe balancing and difficulty issues. A proper fight with an enemy like this should be exciting and tense with lots of mechanics and strategies to consider, but the nature of the game just gives you access to inherently overpowered weapons, and just saying don't use them then is not an excuse. If it's intentionally in the game, you have every right to use it. So there's really no excuse for how absurdly easy and disappointing this fight is, but I'm sad to say this won't be the last one like this either. Anyway, with the boss dead, we get some loot and the Emerald Key. We're getting close to the end of the game, so we continue past the boss room and make our way out to the hub area. Using the Emerald Key, we move to the next level of the hub and get a save point, another elevator with a red key slot, and just one door to enter this time. So we head on in. So this is where those secret enemies we found in the Scouring Rush come from. These guys are actually super interesting lore-wise. The translated guide says they're a tribe that appears out of nowhere and worships spears. Originally human, they now act on instinct and have expanded their living space by making holes in fallen towers. These guys are actually quite difficult to deal with a ton of health and primarily being weak to magic rather than my standard guns and melee. Anyway, the red Sand Spire's looks pretty accurately represent what it's like to play through this area. It's a reddish, dark, hellish landscape, and playing through it is just the same. It's dark with a very low draw distance, and it's really not clear whether you're in an open desert exposed to the sky, or whether there are walls all around you. There are large rocky structures all over the place, so the entire map always feels enclosed. But the fact that there's a dark red fog to everything that obscures anything beyond 10 or so meters in front of you creates this heavily oppressive feeling to the entire area that's thematically pretty great design considering the implications of what we'll see at the end of the area. We're finally getting close to the King's Spear that we've been searching for since the beginning. It's our key to escape and we're right at the cusp of finding it. But the spear isn't going to make it easy on us. It applies a seal status effect, which disables your ability to use any magic at all. But even worse is that every now and then you'll hear a sharp ringing sound that drains a portion of your health, and it's pretty significant. FromSoft has managed to create a situation here where I had to genuinely strategize how to make my way through this area. I tried fighting the enemies with melee and guns, as you'll see with the footage here and there, but for the most part I ended up using magic. If you check the databook entry for these guys, they have a much higher physical defensive stats than magic, and tons of health on top of that. So first thing was making sure I had Seal Null gear equipped, and to have any HP recovery gear I could find. I haven't talked about it much, but the hidden properties of items have all kinds of effects. Some resist statuses, some nullify them, some increase HP or MP at varying amounts, some increase physical or magical defensive stats, so on and so on. Even after all that prep, this area is still pretty difficult. For one, there are some rooms that give you a ton of new gear which end up making me go over my total weight. This area is already very difficult to see because the draw distance is so short, but also adding a status effect that fills your entire screen with a vignette of color makes it even harder to tell what the hell's going on. So I recommend trying to run a low weight kit if you can. For me, all the gear I needed was pretty heavy, so this is quite a problem for me later on. The other issue is the problem of actually casting spells. As I mentioned earlier, each cast of a ring is tied to its durability. One cast removes 1 durability point, so a ring with 10 out of 10 durability has 10 casts before it breaks. I didn't really have a lot of strong offensive magic gear that I set up when I went through, so it took quite a few casts to kill the enemies sometimes. There's a constant management of fighting off enemies and making sure I don't break any of my rings, so I had to swap them out quite often. And as I mentioned before, each offensive spell stat refers to a combo of 2 spell damage types. Element for fire and ice magic damage, Solvent for poison and acid magic damage, Spirit for light and dark magic damage. So I highly recommend you plan accordingly with whatever gear you have to get the most damage across all the rings you have. This area really felt like a proper difficulty spike with all the management you have to deal with, and even though it's hard, I quite enjoyed the dynamics of trying to adjust my kit to the challenge. This is exactly the kind of potential I see in Shadow Tower Abyss that makes the easier parts so disappointing. There are these specific moments where the game throws multiple concerns at you all at once that makes you have to strategize on how to deal with all of it. The dismemberment mechanic is a pretty consistent example of ways they tried to introduce these dynamic situations. So it's pretty clear FromSoftware was capable of creating moments like these, I just wish they did it more often. Anyway, with all that said, I struggle quite a bit through this area as I make my way deeper through the desert. But I finally find my way to the end despite becoming over-encumbered halfway through. So we finally find what we've been looking for. Oh, well, would you look who it is? It's our favorite buddy, Patches. To be honest, I'm a little sad we don't get to fight and kill him ourselves. But hey, at least he learned his lesson one way or another. So, after moving a bit further, we find what we've actually been looking for. Well, shit. After this weird boss creature comes up out of the ground and says more esoteric crap to us, we just blast him away with a shotgun without even blinking. At this point, I'm just used to these pathetic boss fights. Moving on. He drops the next key and we head back out to find Rurifon waiting for us with even more esoteric dialogue. Yeah, by the way, that weapon she gives us seals and blinds you when you use it. Thanks, Rurifon. What a great weapon. Yeah, make sure to throw that shit in storage or just sell it. Anyway, back to the lift. Wait, what the fuck is that? This is a cool little moment on my way back out of this area. This was clearly an enemy that is nothing like anything else in the entire game. Honestly, I'm not quite sure at all what this guy's deal is. In the English translation, he's called a Sorgand, and the Japanese strategy guide just basically tells you how to fight him and doesn't give any lore information on him at all. But it's pretty clear how you're supposed to deal with him. Shoot him in the eye and don't bother with any normal damage, he's basically immune to everything else. He's not much of a challenge, but he drops one of the best chest pieces in the game that gives you high HP MP recovery, which I end up using for the rest of my playthrough. Once he's down, I use speed hacks to hobble my over-encumbered ass back to his shop to store my items and head back out to the hub. We're in the final stretch of the game now, just 2.5 more areas left. Using the ruby key to reach the next floor of the tower, there are 2 doors available to us once again, so I choose Man, yet another visually fantastic looking area. Before, I had said that when I first arrived in the blue light area that it was very alien, and to a similar degree so was the Scouring Rush. But this is the first time the game moved from generically alien to H.R. Geiger levels of alien. I love this look. From the inhuman organic looking walls, to the creepy webs covering the windows, to the disgusting veiny tentacles cutting into the floor, all leading back to whatever the hell this thing is spraying out the fog in this area. All the enemies here are some form of the same base type, a weird flying bug-like creature with a skull for a face making these horrific warbling sounds. They're known as Falto, and they have an interesting explanation of their purpose within the tower. The translated guide describes them as mysterious flying creatures, neither animate nor inanimate. They attack intruders and comfort the spirits of tower dwellers who have fallen in the midst of their ambitions. And also, a spirit that flies through the air, transcending space and inviting visitors into the darkness. These things are relatively easy to deal with, but they definitely have their moments and will do significant damage if they hit you. The real issue with these is twofold. First, they remain invisible until you hit them, so you have to wait for them to shoot these spirit waves at you so you know where they are, and can shoot back at them before they move. And second, sometimes 2 of them will be combined in one, and you'll have to fight them the same way. They'll break apart when you shoot them, and then you'll have to fight them both separately. The real challenge of these guys is fighting multiple at once, because you're being shot from 2 directions at once, and it's hard to avoid attacks you can't even see coming. So ideally, identifying and taking one out as quickly as possible is the best strategy in my experience. Also, they have lower magic defense than physical, so it's better to use magic than guns. But typically I use guns anyway though, because magic spells are pretty hard to land on these guys. Now I said there's only one enemy in this area, but there is another one actually. Gravity, and it kills me a lot. I die in this area more than any other area in the game for sure. The rooms here are filled with massive holes in the floor that lead to immediate death, as well as moving platforms that you can walk on to take you around to access different parts of the room. I highly recommend before navigating any of this treacherous terrain that you get rid of all the enemies in the room first so you can take your time and make it through. If you do all of that, generally the fog area is pretty much a breeze. So when you first enter, you come across this awesome looking wall. This is the Tetris door. You're supposed to go around the fog area, find the 4 pieces, then come back here to put them in the slots to open the door. Pretty straightforward, and they give you one immediately nearby, so there's really only 3 to find. By the way, there are these weird little sets of 3 eyeballs in most of the rooms that you can interact with to turn the lamps on above them. They provide basically no light and have no function whatsoever. Cool, I guess. One really nice touch is how FromSoftware used the fog as an actual mechanic to make it difficult to find the Tetris pieces. You eventually find yourself traveling across one of the tentacles, leading back to the main room to the top of where this weird fog-spewing creature is. If you hit it with a weapon, it'll die and stop spraying fog, making it much easier to see in this area. But before I did this, I actually missed a Tetris piece on a body hidden in one of the corners of the first rooms you enter. So while backtracking to look for the last piece, I was surprised to see it was all the way back towards the beginning. Now that the fog is gone, spotting hidden items or pathways across the room becomes a lot easier, which is a great way of utilizing the fog mechanic in a way that is more than just an aesthetic choice. Once you finally collect all the Tetris pieces, slap them in the door, and this leads us to the boss room. Whoa, what an entrance. The second the dialogue stops, 5 of the Falto pairs of enemies suddenly pop into existence and immediately spray magic at you. There was genuinely a lot to take in, and I was primarily using a gun, which as I said before, slows you down when you walk or turn. This boss fight is a mixture of trying to dodge magic being shot from me from all directions, not letting any enemies get close, turning slowly and trying to shoot each enemy as they disappear in front of you, so on and so on. But if you just focus on the boss itself though, the additional enemies will die if you beat him, so just shoot him a bunch to take him down. We go over to where he originally spawned in the room, pick up the Tetris piece for the next door, and we finally make our way to the worst area in the game. This area has quite an interesting look going on. There are large walls on all sides, stretching up to a high ceiling with rocky outcrops all throughout, and moving platforms coming out from under the map being carried by this current of yellow magic below. Unfortunately though, the cool visuals belie the frustrating gameplay this place gives you. The way this area works is each path is a big long hallway like this one, with these moving blocks carrying you from one end to the other. These blocks infinitely spawn one after another, but they only ever move in one direction until you hit a switch to send them back in the opposite direction. Along the way, there are stopping off points with rooms to go into. So as you ride the blocks across, you're supposed to step off to these little outcrops and enter these rooms. The problem is not the moving blocks or the annoying flying enemies that attack you while you ride, though that definitely doesn't help. The real crime is the fact that it's nothing but a bunch of hallways leading to singular small rooms filled with shitloads of loot. Now, up front, tons of loot sounds pretty awesome, right? Who doesn't like just getting tons and tons of useful and powerful weapons, armor, and rings? But the problem is, 1, you're in the last bit of the game where having any of this gear makes no difference whatsoever, and problem number 2 is carry weight, once again. These items weigh a lot, and you get a lot of them. Luckily, one of the first rooms you can access has a shop where you can sell or store items. But if you want to come back to it, you have to go all the way to the end while fighting off enemies, hit the switch, then ride slowly all the way back to the start again. And having to do this is not fun. It's tedious and boring. You can have a game be difficult, but you never want it to be boring. Anyway, so let's talk about the enemies that add on to the pain of this area. Design-wise, they're actually pretty cool. They're these really interesting geometric-shaped flying enemies known as Guardia. According to the strategy guide, they're a species created by the Tower Administrator to guard the treasury. This is actually a very interesting little lore piece I didn't know until writing this, but this entire area apparently acts as a treasury for the tower. I'm not sure exactly why the tower needs a treasury, but then again, I'm not a plant alien from outer space, so what do I know? Anyway, these Guardia are actually quite annoying to fight. Some of them just fly at you and do damage if they hit you, while others shoot really strong magic at you. These smaller ones are generally pretty easy, and they can actually be shot in half with the dismemberment mechanic. Also, is it just me, or doesn't the sound they make sound like the effect they use in Dragon Ball Z fighting games when you dodge attacks? Take a listen. Anyway, there are these other ones covered in eyeballs that seem more defensive, but you can still take them out with enough bullets or magic. And then there's the big Guardia, which can be quite a pain in the ass to fight because their magic hits so hard and stuns you. But it seems if you hit them in the small center where the spinning piece is, they'll die instantly. So either get good and land shots directly in the center, or wait until they open up to cast magic and hit them before they hit you. So as you move through the area going from room to room, you can't actually go to all the rooms on your first time through. There are usually 2 rooms on each side of the hallway directly across from each other. If you choose a door, when you come out, you don't have enough time to really make it across to the door on the opposite side before the block moves too far away. You have to go all the way to the end of the first room, which has no switch to send you back, and choose left or right between 2 main branching paths. The left room leads you down where you actually want to go, and the right is just a dead end. Both of the paths and all the rooms in them have loot in them, so if you want to see all the loot like I did, just go whatever path you want first. I went left, so heading in just leads to a hallway that looks exactly like the first, except there's a switch at the beginning to change the direction when you want to head back to the first room. Through this hall are more doors with more chests and more loot, but also these 2 very unique chests that the game has yet to give us anything like up to this point. You know, despite the frustration of making one of the last areas of the game a big glorified loot chest, it's still hard not to get that little hit of dopamine when you get a shiny new toy to try out and play with. In this case, these 2 chests give you magic rings. The holy ring is called the Vanity Swell, and it gives you access to a badass holy spell that shoots out what looks like a holy version of the King's Spear, and the other is Chaos Eater, which shoots out dark lightning. I equipped the Vanity Swell, and I end up using it quite a lot through the end of the game because it's so strong. Continuing on, you eventually reach the end of the hall leading to this room. If you try to enter and approach the enemies in this room, they'll ball up into their shells and be immune to all damage. So you have to hit them at a range. And by the way, spells are not auto-locked to enemies you're pointed at. Aiming spells is actually quite hard for any of the projectile-based spells because most of them go directly where you're pointing. So if you're off even by a little bit, you just waste one of your very valuable and limited casts. This made me spend way longer than I wanted to fighting these guys. By the way, did I mention they shoot lightning spells that arc off these spiky pillars and hit you no matter what? So you better have health bots and kill them quick. After taking them out, I get this. The plants tell us that they landed from the dark heavens, which refers to them flying through space, and that they reject the light, which we know is apparently toxic to them. They claim that life will flow from the conflict, which the guide established as their primary purpose, to sustain their life and the life of the creatures that rely on them. So after all that, we get one of the best items in the game, the gold face, which has this description.
The ever-brilliant gold mask.
I can't help but draw parallels to the gold mask in Elden Ring when it clearly says gold mask in the item description. This makes me wonder if there was any inspiration for the gold mask character from all the way back to this game. Knowing the way FromSoft carries references throughout the years, I wouldn't doubt it, and I'm sure the guys who love theory crafting around things like this could probably find even more parallels than I can between the two. Anyway, now that we did the left path, we can go back down the right. There's really not much else to say about this area. Once you grab all the rest of the loot, you can return back to the Blue Light Area Hub, where Rurufan meets us for the last time. She asks us to kill her, which I'm very inclined not to do, but I have actually tried killing her a few times throughout the game as a fun little challenge. And up to this point, I was never really powerful enough to get close to taking her down. But now we've come all this way, climbed to the very heights of the Shadow Tower, gathered hundreds of pounds of loot, and fought countless enemies. By this point, we can finally take her on and fulfill her wish of ending her life. After finally killing Rurufan, she gives us another really powerful ring which has no magical abilities at all, but gives a massive boost to our stats and nullifies all statuses, which is a pretty insane set of benefits. I also thought the fact that the two special rings we acquired from the glowy chest were the two spells that Rurufan herself uses, which is quite a nice touch. It makes them feel all the more significant and makes me feel all the more powerful to have defeated her with them. Anyway, with Rurufan dead and all the previous areas up to this point complete, we can finally head to the last area of the game, and to me the most visually striking one out of all of them. Now this is an appropriate aesthetic for our final area, and I just love when RPGs present things like this. When you're at the end of a long journey, give me an ethereal landscape, or massive battle arenas, or in this case, dark gothic castles. I'm all for it. Moving on, there's only two types of enemies in this area. The first are the Pestis, which are these ghost-like creatures that carry colored flames. They're used for the main mechanic of this area, which I'll explain in a bit. But the second enemies are the Nemesis, which the translated guide describes as the most powerful rulers of the towers and the shadows created by powerful spirits. The shadows are deployed in various places and all their information is conveyed to the High Ruler. These guys are the actual enemy and threat of this area, but even they aren't much of a threat really. Every time you fight them, you only fight one at a time, but even more disappointingly is the Pestis enemies are completely non-hostile. I have no idea what FromSoft's motivation was to set up the final area like this. You only fight like 4 or 5 of these Nemesis enemies, and that is it for the entire area. Just when you're at the end of the game, and there's this epic gothic castle area where you're meant to fight the rulers of this evil shadow tower, the actual process of fighting them is totally trivial. I mean, just look at this. I really think this sums up everything I've been saying about balance and difficulty. There's really not much more to say. So let's move on to what this area is like mechanics-wise and how the Pestis enemies are involved. Like I said before, all these enemies are totally non-hostile, and this is backed up by their lore description. They're described as a creature that serves a high-ranking ruler in the tower. They do not care if there are intruders, but exist only to awaken the ruler. As far as I'm aware, there isn't anything to really do with these enemies, but I have seen clips of people killing them and having them drop loot. But for whatever reason, I just get nothing or some arrows. So honestly, I'm not sure what to make of them. Anyways, in this area you have this standard green Pestis, and this darker unique Pestis that holds a red flame. This is the one you'll have to find and kill in each of the branching paths of the illusion area. Each time you kill it, it drops a key you can put in a pedestal to activate these teleportation pads. You're first introduced to this concept in this room where there's a single pedestal that leads to a door with a teleportation pad behind it. This leads further into a larger room with 4 separate pedestals, each facing one of the different paths you can take. But each pedestal activates a specific color of teleportation pad, so you have to do them in the right order. So you kill the fire Pestis to get the key, put it on the pedestal, follow the newly opened path via the teleportation pads, find the Pestis at the end of the new path and kill it to get another key, then head all the way back to the main room to open up the next path. You just rinse and repeat until all paths are open to you. Also, just an interesting note, there are these large statue heads that you can interact with that will say some weird obscure stuff to you. They're pretty interesting, but I'm not sure what their deal is exactly. Anyway, there are these doors with the busts of Pestis enemies that have flames light up in their hands as you progress through the area. Once all the flames are lit, and the flame at the top of the door is also lit, you can pass through them. There's a few throughout the area, as one is right at the beginning that leads to the final boss. This door takes you down a long and foreboding hallway filled with these creepy statue braziers. It leads to a room with a railing around a big opening looking down at this bizarre scene. When I first saw this, I could barely understand what the hell I was looking at. With the darkness surrounding it, it kinda just looks like a room suspended completely separate from the rest of reality. But if you continue past to the teleportation pad beyond, it makes a little more sense. And now the so-called epic final fight of this area begins. This guy's not much of a real threat. He jumps around, swings a sword, uses magic, and occasionally summons a copy of himself that you want to take out quickly. It actually seems that the dismemberment mechanic is the key to winning this fight, other than just blasting him with raw damage, which always works in this game unfortunately. Here's how the translated guide describes how to fight him. If he loses his right arm, his movements slow down and his attacks change to kicking and lasers. If other parts of his body are destroyed, up to 2 copies will appear, so focus on the right arm. Dodge the magic and wait to see what happens, then close the distance and attack the right arm. Really, this fight once again is just a bit of a joke, especially for the penultimate boss fight of the entire game. The setting, the build-up, and the boss room itself are all fantastic. But there's always something slightly off with the lack of any dramatic music or sound, mixed in with the lack of any real danger or challenge with the fight. Don't get me wrong, having no music throughout the game is core to the aesthetic of it. It's meant to be a dark, dismal place that makes you feel totally isolated as you climb all the way up and leave nothing but empty hallways where you could only hear your footsteps as you leave a trail of dead creatures behind you. But when you're up against one of the biggest, most important enemies in the game, not having any music at this moment just makes it feel like any other generic creature. No drama, no grandiosity, it's just another fight like any other fight that feels like it has no build-up or any consequences to it. I really think even if the fight itself was trivial, just having a bit of musical direction behind certain key moments such as this one would have dramatically changed the feeling of the fight itself to be more impactful. So besides the visuals of the room, the fight is totally forgettable, and that's a damn shame. But so we beat the boss and get the Amethyst Lift key, taking us to the final boss of Shadow Tower Abyss. We're finally here. We're finally at the top of the Shadow Tower, ready to take on whatever awaits us. Heading into the final door, we find ourselves in a long, dark hallway, leading up with this awesome green pulsing effect traveling along the walls. And at the end of the hallway, we open the door and get to take in the true appearance of what the tower really looks like. Plant-like, dark halls with glowing green and blue highlights forming organic shapes all along the wall, with leaf-like doors leading to the main chamber where the final boss awaits. Let's take a look. While not perfect, I'm actually quite pleased with this fight for what it is. Again, there's no music, but knowing this is the final boss, along with the mixture of the sound coming from your attacks, the enemy's attacks, and the electric thumping sounds of the heart of the tower around you, it all clashes in a way that creates a dramatic, intense moment where you're finally fighting to end it all. The heart of the tower summons an evil, plant-infected version of Rurufan. At this point, I'm plenty powerful enough to just wail on her over and over while dodging her attacks. Unfortunately, they made Rurufan to have this particular quirk of just dodging left and right, which forces her into corners and also makes it predictable where she'll end up. So, once you kill the plant Rurufan, you can attack the heart for a brief period, and it'll keep resummoning her. But after hitting the heart twice, I defeat the final boss and get this dialogue. and the final cutscene of the game. And there it is. After around 10 or so hours of gameplay, we have finally beaten Shadow Tower Abyss. This game was really a hidden gem from FromSoft, and I'm really glad I decided to give it a try as a fan of all their modern titles. You can really tell that FromSoftware's design philosophies were really concentrated back around this time period. Shadow Tower Abyss is a game that focuses hard on its major themes and has a strong sense of identity that it isn't afraid to show you throughout the entire game. I just wish that much more of the story of this game was more clear in ways that the game itself would show you rather than having to be read from a game manual. The overarching story of the game would have been virtually impossible to piece together purely from the details given in the game itself. I think there's a major theme of Shadow Tower Abyss that is never really clear, but is crucially important to the conclusions you're meant to draw from the story. While you are a victim trapped in the tower, ultimately you're an invader who threatens the life of the tower and the creatures who depend on it. There's a great juxtaposition between the ignorant indifference of the alien creatures whose entire goal is to simply survive, and our goal to survive by fighting back against the tower that has trapped us. I think that there are really no good or bad guys in this story. Everyone is just trying to survive the only way they know how. And that could have been a great realization for the player after feeling oppressed by the tower as an evil entity throughout the game. Still, what the game does show you feels quite distinct and fleshed out. There's just enough to get the sense of each area while leaving enough mystery to keep you constantly curious. All in all, the game's mechanics and combat are what they are, and some people may not like it. I personally thought I wouldn't until I gave it a try, and ended up really enjoying it. As I said before though, I just wish there was better balance in difficulty and a further exploration of the game's strong points. The moments where combat was a dynamic situation with multiple concerns were the highlights of the game. Overall, I had a great time with Shadow Tower Abyss despite its faults, and I highly recommend at least giving it a try, especially if you're a fan of dungeon crawlers or FromSoftware's other works. I think there's a lot to appreciate here, and I just wish more people knew about it.